It started with 3 quiet phone calls. 3 experienced FBI agents, each with decades of service, each with spotless records, each with one thing in common. They had worked on investigations involving Donald Trump. What happened next would expose the darkest secret of the Trump administration's second term and destroy Kash Patel's carefully constructed image as a principled law enforcement leader. The 68-page lawsuit filed in federal court didn't just accuse the FBI director of political retaliation, it revealed something far more shocking. Audio recordings, documented conversations, and sworn testimony that proved Patel had been systematically purging the FBI of anyone who didn't pass his political loyalty test. But when cornered about these explosive allegations during his congressional testimony, Patel's response wasn't denial or deflection. It was something that left even seasoned Washington observers speechless, and fundamentally changed how America views the weaponization of federal law enforcement. FBI Headquarters, Washington, D.C., January 20. The morning started like any other for Brian Driscoll, the acting FBI director who had been keeping the seat warm until Trump's nominee could be confirmed. Driscoll had served the Bureau for over 2 decades, rising through the ranks based on merit, competence, and an unwavering commitment to the FBI's mission of equal justice under law. He had survived multiple administrations, both Republican and Democrat, by focusing on the work and staying out of politics. That morning, he thought he was getting a routine briefing call from the incoming FBI director. He had no idea he was about to receive the most shocking ultimatum of his career. The call came at exactly 9:15 a.m. Kash Patel's voice was calm, businesslike, almost casual as he delivered what would later be described in court documents as a political hit list disguised as a personnel discussion. But there was something in Patel's tone, a certainty that suggested this wasn't a request or even an order. This was an inevitability, a foregone conclusion that Driscoll was simply being informed about rather than consulted on. "Brian," Patel began, and even the use of his first name felt calculated, designed to create false intimacy before delivering the blow. "I need you to understand something about how we're going to be doing things moving forward. My bosses have been very clear about their expectations." The word bosses hung in the air. In the FBI, there was supposed to be only one boss above the director, the Attorney General. But everyone understood that when Kash Patel talked about bosses, he meant the political operatives in the White House who had put him in power and could just as easily remove him. What Patel said next would be documented in sworn testimony, preserved in court filings, and eventually become the centerpiece of one of the most explosive whistleblower cases in FBI history. "We need to remove anyone who worked on criminal investigations against President Trump. All of them. I don't care if they chose those assignments or not. I don't care if they were just following orders. The FBI tried to put the president in jail, and he hasn't forgotten it." Driscoll felt the blood drain from his face. In 20 years with the Bureau, he had never heard anything like this. Not from Republican directors, not from Democratic directors, not even during the most politically charged moments in recent FBI history. This wasn't about policy differences or organizational restructuring. This was about political revenge, pure and simple, and it was being ordered by the man who was about to become the most powerful law enforcement official in the country. "Kash," Driscoll said, trying to keep his voice steady, "that's not how the FBI works. We don't fire agents for doing their job. We don't punish people for following lawful orders from previous administrations. That would be illegal, and it would destroy the Bureau's credibility forever." But Patel's response revealed just how far down this rabbit hole the new administration was prepared to go. "Brian, I need you to understand something. This isn't a debate. This isn't a discussion. This is what's going to happen. And if you can't handle it, then you won't be around to see it happen." The threat was unmistakable. Driscoll could either participate in what he viewed as the systematic destruction of the FBI's independence, or he could find himself on the list of people being purged. But what Patel said next was even more chilling, and it would later become the smoking gun that destroyed his credibility in court. "Look, it's not personal. It's just business. But we need to know who we can trust. As long as you weren't prolific on social media, didn't donate to the Democratic Party, and didn't vote for Kamala Harris in the 2024 election, the vetting won't be an issue for you." The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. but its implications would reverberate for months. Patel had just laid out explicit political criteria for employment in the FBI. Not competence, not experience, not dedication to the mission, but partisan political loyalty. And he had done it so casually, so matter-of-factly, that it was clear he saw nothing wrong with turning the nation's premier law enforcement agency into a political enforcement arm of the Trump administration. For Driscoll, the choice was stark and immediate. He could comply with orders he viewed as fundamentally corrupt and illegal, or he could resist and face the consequences. Unknown to Patel, Driscoll made a decision that would eventually bring down the FBI director's carefully constructed facade. He started documenting everything, every conversation, every directive, every moment that violated his oath to the Constitution and his duty to the American people. The purge began immediately. Within days of Patel's official confirmation as FBI director, the termination letters started going out. Not through normal channels, not through the usual bureaucratic processes that typically governed personnel decisions at the Bureau, but through terse, one-page emails sent to subordinates who were ordered to deliver the firing letters to agents who had dedicated their lives to federal law enforcement. The first to go was Jensen, a 20-year veteran whose only crime was having worked on January 6th. The decision to fire him came after Patel and his deputy Dan Bongino faced criticism on social media from Trump supporters who had somehow identified Jensen as being involved in prosecuting January 6th. The speed of the termination was breathtaking, from social media outcry to firing letter in less than 48 hours, with no due process, no investigation, no opportunity for the agent to defend himself or even understand what he was being accused of. Then came Evans, another longtime agent who found himself targeted after a former FBI employee who had been fired for refusing COVID vaccination requirements launched a social media campaign against him. The campaign was vicious, personal, and based entirely on speculation and innuendo, but it was enough for Patel. Rather than defend his agent or investigate the claims, he simply added Evans to the growing list of people being purged from the Bureau. But it was the attempted firing of an FBI pilot that finally pushed Driscoll over the edge. The pilot was a military veteran, a man who had served his country in uniform before joining the FBI, and he had become the target of pro-Trump social media scrutiny over completely false claims that he had participated in the Mar-a-Lago investigation. The claims were not just wrong, they were demonstrably, provably false. The pilot had never been involved in the Mar-a-Lago case in any capacity. He wasn't even in the same field office, but facts didn't matter to the social media mob, and apparently they didn't matter to Kash Patel either. When Driscoll tried to save the pilot's job by presenting evidence of his innocence, Patel's response was swift and final. "I don't care," he said, according to court documents. "Perception is reality. If people think he was involved, then he's a liability. Get rid of him." The pilot was fired the same day as Driscoll, a coincidence that was anything but coincidental. The pattern was clear and undeniable. FBI agents and officials were being fired not for misconduct, not for poor performance, not for violations of FBI policy or federal law, but for failing to pass a political loyalty test administered by social media mobs and Trump political operatives. The FBI, which was supposed to be insulated from political pressure and partisan considerations, was being turned into an instrument of political revenge. But Patel made a critical error. He underestimated the integrity and courage of the agents he was trying to intimidate. Instead of quietly accepting their terminations and fading into obscurity, Driscoll, Jensen, and Evans decided to fight back. They hired Mark Zaid, a lawyer with experience in whistleblower cases and a reputation for taking on powerful government officials who abuse their authority, and they began building a case that would expose the full extent of the political purge taking place inside the FBI. The lawsuit they filed in federal court was devastating in its precision and scope. 68 pages of detailed allegations, supported by documented conversations, audio recordings, and sworn testimony from multiple witnesses. The complaint didn't just allege wrongdoing, it provided a roadmap of how the Trump administration was systematically destroying the FBI's independence and turning it into a political weapon. The explosive allegations included direct quotes from Patel acknowledging that he was firing agents based on their political beliefs, documented evidence of political litmus tests being applied to FBI personnel decisions, proof that social media campaigns by Trump supporters were being used to target career law enforcement officers for termination, and most damaging of all, Patel's own admission that he was carrying out these purges to save his own job, because his ability to keep his own job depended on the removal of agents who worked on cases involving the president. The lawsuit painted a picture of an FBI director who was more concerned with appeasing political masters than protecting the American people, an official who was willing to destroy careers, undermine investigations and compromise national security in order to demonstrate loyalty to Donald Trump, a man who had sworn an oath to defend the Constitution but was actively violating that oath every day he remained in office. When news of the lawsuit broke, the political world erupted. Conservative media, which had initially celebrated Patel's appointment as a long-overdue cleaning house at the FBI, suddenly found themselves defending the indefensible. Liberal media, which had warned about the dangers of politicizing federal law enforcement, felt vindicated but horrified that their worst predictions were coming true. And career FBI agents around the country realized that their worst fears about the new administration were not just being confirmed, they were being exceeded. The timing of the lawsuit was particularly damaging for Patel. It was filed just days before he was scheduled to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee in what was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing. Instead, it became a high-stakes confrontation where Patel would have to answer under oath for the explosive allegations contained in the federal court filing. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, a Republican who had generally supported Trump administration appointees, asked the question that everyone was waiting for. Director Patel, have you fired people because they voted for Vice President Harris? It was a straightforward question that demanded a straightforward answer, and Patel's response would either clear the air or destroy his credibility forever. I don't ask people who they vote for, and neither does the FBI, Patel replied, his voice steady and confident. It was a clear, unequivocal denial that seemed to put the issue to rest. But anyone who had read the lawsuit knew that this answer was not just misleading, it was potentially perjury. The court documents contained detailed allegations of Patel doing exactly what he had just denied doing, including specific conversations where he had explicitly discussed agents' voting patterns and political affiliations. Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut, pressed further. Have you or your surrogates asked about FBI agents' personal politics when conducting security clearance reviews or polygraph examinations? Again, Patel denied the allegations. No, we have not. But again, the lawsuit contained evidence that contradicted his sworn testimony, including documented instances where political beliefs had been explicitly discussed during personnel reviews and security clearance process. The disconnect between Patel's testimony and the allegations in the lawsuit was so stark that legal experts immediately began discussing the possibility of perjury charges. But Patel wasn't just lying about the facts. He was lying about something far more fundamental. He was lying about the nature of what the Trump administration was doing to the FBI and what it meant for American democracy. The most explosive moment in his testimony came when Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey confronted Patel directly about the political purge allegation. Booker, his voice rising with indignation, accused Patel of generational destruction of the FBI and of assaulting the institutional integrity of the Bureau. But instead of defending his record or explaining his actions, Patel's response revealed the depth of his desperation and the weakness of his position. Senator, Patel said, his voice betraying none of the confidence he had displayed earlier, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. You don't understand what it's like to have your job depend on satisfying people who don't care about the law, don't care about the Constitution, and don't care about anything except political revenge. The admission was stunning. Patel had just acknowledged, under oath, that he was making FBI personnel decisions based on political pressure rather than law enforcement considerations. But Booker wasn't finished. Mr. Patel, I think you're not going to be around long. I think this might be your last oversight hearing. Because as much as you supplicate yourself to the will of Donald Trump and not the Constitution of the United States of America, Donald Trump has shown us in his first term and this term, he is not loyal to people like you. He will cut you loose. The prediction would prove to be prophetic, but not in the way anyone expected. Patel's response to Booker's challenge wasn't denial or defiance. It was something much more revealing and ultimately much more damaging. Standing up at the witness table, his hands gripping the microphone, Patel looked directly into the cameras and delivered what would become his political epitaph. "You want to know the truth?" Patel said, his voice now carrying a tone of barely controlled desperation. "The truth is that I never wanted this job. The truth is that I was told by people much more powerful than me that if I didn't clean house at the FBI, they would find someone who... The truth is that every decision I've made, every person I've fired, every policy I've implemented, has been dictated by people who care more about political loyalty than they do about law enforcement." The silence that followed was deafening. In less than 2 minutes, Kash Patel had admitted to Congress, under oath, on national television, that he had been systematically destroying the FBI's independence on orders from unnamed political masters. He had confirmed every allegation in the lawsuit. He had validated every fear about the politicization of federal law enforcement, and he had signed his own political death warrant. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Conservative commentators who had defended Patel for months suddenly found themselves unable to explain away his own admissions. Liberal commentators felt no satisfaction in being proven right about something so fundamentally damaging to American institutions, and FBI agents around the country realized that their worst fears about political interference in law enforcement had been not just confirmed but exceeded by someone who was supposed to be their advocate and protector. Within hours of Patel's testimony, Republican senators who had previously supported him began distancing themselves from his leadership. Senator Lindsey Graham, who had voted to confirm Patel, issued a statement saying he was deeply troubled by the FBI director's admission. Senator Susan Collins called for an immediate investigation into the political purge allegations. Even Senator Ted Cruz, one of Trump's most loyal supporters, said that Patel's testimony raised serious questions about the administration of the FBI. But the most damaging response came from an unexpected source. Career FBI agents who had remained silent during months of political pressure suddenly began speaking out. A group of more than 200 current and former FBI employees released a joint statement condemning Patel's leadership and calling for his immediate resignation. The statement, coordinated by the FBI Agents Association, accused Patel of betraying his oath of office and undermining the constitutional principles that are supposed to guide federal law enforcement. The statement went further than just criticizing Patel's actions. It provided additional evidence of the political purge that had been taking place inside the Bureau. Agents described receiving questionnaires about their political affiliations. Supervisors reported being pressured to identify subordinates who had worked on Trump-related investigations. Support staff talked about being asked about their social media activity and their voting patterns during routine performance reviews. The picture that emerged was of an FBI that had been completely transformed from a professional law enforcement agency into a political enforcement mechanism. Investigations were being opened or closed based on political considerations. Resources were being allocated to satisfy political masters rather than address genuine threats to national security. And career agents who had dedicated their lives to protecting the American people were being fired or intimidated into silence for doing their jobs. The legal implications of Patel's admissions were immediate and severe. Federal prosecutors, including some within the Justice Department, began discussing whether his testimony constituted admissions of criminal conduct. Civil rights lawyers started preparing additional lawsuits on behalf of other FBI employees who had been targeted for political reasons, and congressional investigators launched formal inquiries into the extent of political interference in FBI operations. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the complete collapse of Patel's credibility as a law enforcement leader. The man who had been positioned as a reformer who would clean up the FBI and restore its integrity had instead revealed himself to be the very thing he claimed to be fighting against: a political operative who was willing to destroy the Bureau in order to serve partisan interests. The three agents who had filed the original lawsuit, Driscoll, Jensen, and Evans, found themselves vindicated beyond their wildest expectations. Their decision to risk everything by challenging Patel in federal court had not only exposed the truth about what was happening inside the FBI, but had also forced the FBI director to admit his crimes on national television. Mark Zaid, Their attorney called it the most complete vindication of whistleblower courage he had ever witnessed. The lawsuit itself became secondary to the admissions Patel had made under oath, but the legal process continued, and additional evidence continued to emerge that painted an even more disturbing picture of political interference in federal law enforcement. Internal FBI documents obtained through the discovery process showed systematic efforts to identify and remove agents based on their political beliefs. Email chains revealed discussions among senior FBI officials about the political reliability of their subordinates, and audio recordings surfaced of Patel and other senior officials discussing how to circumvent federal employment protections in order to fire agents who were viewed as politically unreliable. The cumulative effect of these revelations was to completely destroy public confidence in the FBI under Patel's leadership. Polling showed that Americans across the political spectrum had lost faith in the Bureau's ability to conduct fair and impartial investigation. Foreign intelligence services began questioning whether they could trust the FBI to protect sensitive information that might be used for political purposes, and state and local law enforcement agencies started reconsidering their cooperation with federal investigators who might be operating under political constraints. 6 months after the lawsuit was filed, the damage to American law enforcement was becoming clear. The FBI's reputation, built over decades of professional law enforcement work, had been severely damaged by revelations of political interference. Ongoing investigations had been compromised by questions about political motivation, and the Bureau's ability to recruit and retain qualified agents had been undermined by uncertainty about whether career advancement would be based on merit or political loyalty. The irony was unmistakable. Kash Patel had been brought in to clean up the FBI and restore its credibility after years of alleged politicization. Instead, he had presided over the most systematic politicization of federal law enforcement in modern American history. The man who had promised to end the weaponization of the FBI had instead weaponized it more thoroughly than any of his predecessors. But perhaps the most damaging aspect of the entire scandal was what it revealed about the broader Trump administration approach to federal law enforcement. Patel's admissions made clear that the political interference at the FBI was not the result of one rogue official making bad decisions, but part of a systematic effort by political operatives to control and manipulate law enforcement agencies for partisan purposes. The three agents who had started it all, Driscoll, Jensen, and Evans, eventually received financial settlements for their wrongful terminations and public vindication for their courage in speaking out. But they also received something more valuable: the knowledge that their willingness to risk everything had helped expose a threat to American democracy that might otherwise have remained hidden until it was too late to stop. Today, when law students study the importance of institutional independence in law enforcement, they often examine the Kash Patel case as an example of what happens when political operatives are allowed to corrupt professional law enforcement agencies. The case serves as a warning about the fragility of democratic institutions and the courage required to defend them when they come under attack. The 68-page lawsuit that started it all remains one of the most important documents in the history of FBI oversight, not just because of what it revealed about political interference in law enforcement, but because of what it demonstrated about the power of ordinary citizens to hold their government accountable when officials abuse their authority. And Kash Patel's shocked response to being confronted with the truth about his own actions remains a testament to the power of transparency and accountability in American democracy. When faced with overwhelming evidence of his misconduct, when cornered by his own admissions under oath, when forced to choose between continuing the lie and telling the truth, he chose to reveal the full extent of what had been done to the FBI under his leadership. But the story didn't end with Patel's shocking congressional admission. In fact, his public breakdown was just the beginning of a chain of events that would reshape American law enforcement and expose the true depth of political corruption in the Trump administration. What happened in the weeks following his testimony would prove that the FBI lawsuit was not an isolated incident, but part of a much broader pattern of abuse that extended to the highest levels of government. The immediate aftermath of Patel's testimony created a crisis at the highest levels of the Trump White House. Senior advisors who had championed Patel's appointment suddenly found themselves scrambling to contain the damage from his public admission. Chief of Staff Susie Wiles reportedly convened emergency meetings with communications directors and legal counsel to develop a response strategy that could somehow explain away an FBI director admitting to systematic political purges on national television. But Trump himself had a different reaction. Sources close to the president revealed that rather than being angry about Patel's admissions, Trump was furious that Patel had gotten caught. During a private meeting in the Oval Office, Trump allegedly told Patel, "You were supposed to clean house quietly. Now everyone knows what we've been doing and it makes me look bad." The president's concern wasn't about the ethics or legality of the political purges, it was about the political damage from having them exposed. This reaction revealed something crucial about the nature of the corruption that had infected federal law enforcement. The political interference at the FBI wasn't the result of rogue officials exceeding their authority. It was a deliberate strategy orchestrated by the highest levels of the Trump administration, with Patel serving as the willing instrument of their political revenge fantasy. The legal implications of Patel's admissions continued to mount in the days following his testimony. Federal prosecutors, including some within the Justice Department itself, began quietly discussing whether his sworn statements constituted admissions of criminal conduct that would require independent investigation. The Hatch Act, which prohibits federal employees from engaging in political activities, had clearly been violated on a massive scale. Civil rights laws protecting federal employees from political retaliation had been systematically ignored, and the FBI's own internal regulations prohibiting political considerations in personnel decisions had been treated as meaningless pieces of paper. More damaging still was the emergence of additional evidence that corroborated every aspect of the original lawsuit. FBI employees who had been too frightened to speak out while Patel was still in power suddenly found the courage to come forward with their own stories of political intimidation and retaliation. A secretary in the FBI's Human Resources Department revealed that she had been ordered to maintain separate files on agents based on their political reliability. A cybersecurity analyst disclosed that he had been reassigned from critical national security work to routine administrative tasks after someone discovered his wife had donated to Democratic candidates. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony of Jennifer Morrison, a 15-year FBI veteran who had worked on counterintelligence cases involving foreign election interference. Morrison revealed that she had been approached by senior FBI officials who asked her to alter her reports to downplay evidence of foreign interference that might benefit Democratic candidates, while emphasizing threats that could harm Republican prospects. When she refused, she found herself subjected to a series of negative performance reviews that seemed designed to force her resignation. "They didn't fire me outright," Morrison testified in a deposition that was later made public. "They just made my life so miserable, my work environment so hostile, that they hoped I would quit on my own. It was psychological torture disguised as personnel management." Her account was corroborated by dozens of other agents who described similar patterns of harassment and intimidation designed to force out anyone who might resist the political transformation of the Bureau. The systematic nature of the political purge became even clearer as more evidence emerged from the lawsuit's discovery process. Internal FBI emails revealed that Patel and his allies had created detailed spreadsheets listing hundreds of agents and their perceived political reliability. The spreadsheets included information about agents' social media activity, their financial contributions to political candidates, their spouses' political affiliations, and even their children's school choices, which were apparently viewed as indicators of political orientation. One particularly damaging email sent by Deputy Director Dan Bongino to a group of senior FBI officials laid out the administration's goals with startling clarity. "We need to remake the FBI from top to bottom. That means getting rid of anyone who might put the law above loyalty, the Constitution above the president, or their oath of office above their political allegiance. This is not about improving law enforcement effectiveness. This is about ensuring that the FBI serves our political interests, rather than some abstract notion of justice." The email was a smoking gun that confirmed what the lawsuit had alleged and what Patel had admitted under oath: a systematic transformation of the FBI from a law enforcement agency into a political weapon. But it also revealed something even more troubling about the scope and ambition of the corruption. The political operatives behind the purge weren't just trying to control the FBI, They were trying to fundamentally alter the nature of American law enforcement. This broader pattern became evident as similar stories emerged from other federal agencies. The Department of Justice was conducting its own political purges, with career prosecutors being reassigned or forced out for handling cases that had implicated Trump or his ally. The Department of Homeland Security was redirecting resources away from investigating domestic terrorism threats posed by right-wing extremists and toward targeting left-wing organizations and immigrant community. The Internal Revenue Service was being pressured to conduct selective audits of Trump's political opponents and their supporters. The scope of the political corruption was breathtaking, but so was the resistance it generated from career federal employees who refused to be intimidated. Led by the example of Driscoll, Jensen, and Evans, hundreds of federal workers began documenting political interference in their agencies. Whistleblower complaints flooded into congressional offices and inspector general offices across the government. Professional associations representing federal employees began organizing resistance to political pressure and retaliation. The most dramatic moment in this growing resistance movement came when a group of 50 FBI agents, led by Jennifer Morrison, staged an unprecedented protest outside FBI headquarters. Wearing their FBI badges and carrying signs reading "Oath to the Constitution, not to the President," and "Law enforcement, not political enforcement," they stood in silent vigil for 8 hours, bearing witness to what they described as the destruction of their agency's integrity. The sight of FBI agents publicly protesting their own director was shocking enough, but what made the demonstration even more powerful was the support it received from unexpected quarters. Retired FBI directors from both Republican and Democratic administrations issued a joint statement supporting the protesting agents and condemning the political interference at the Bureau. Former prosecutors, federal judges, and law enforcement officials from across the country added their voices to the chorus of condemnation. Even some Republican members of Congress, who had initially supported Patel's appointment and defended his early actions, began to distance themselves from his leadership as the full scope of the political purges became clear. Senator Chuck Grassley, who had chaired the Judiciary Committee hearing where Patel made his damaging admissions, issued a statement calling for a comprehensive investigation of political interference at the FBI. Senator John Cornyn, a longtime Trump supporter, said that Patel's actions had crossed lines that should never be crossed in a democracy. The political pressure on Patel became overwhelming as more evidence of his misconduct emerged, and more agents came forward with stories of political retaliation. Conservative media outlets that had initially celebrated his appointment began questioning whether he had gone too far in his zeal to reform the FBI. Liberal commentators, while gratified to see their warnings about political interference vindicated, expressed concern about the long-term damage to American law enforcement institutions. The breaking point came when audio recordings surfaced of Patel's conversations with White House political operatives about using FBI resources for partisan political purposes. In one particularly damaging recording, Patel could be heard discussing plans to open investigations of Democratic governors who had criticized Trump's policies, not because there was evidence of criminal wrongdoing, but because we need to keep them busy defending themselves instead of attacking us. In another recording, Patel discussed using FBI surveillance capabilities to monitor the communications of journalists who had written unfavorable stories about the Trump administration. "We can't prosecute them for doing their jobs," he said, "but we can make sure we know what they're working on and who their sources are. Information is power, and we need to use every advantage we have." These recordings were devastating because they provided direct evidence of Patel's willingness to abuse his authority for political purposes. They also revealed the extent to which he had been directed by White House political operatives to use the FBI as an instrument of political warfare rather than law enforcement. The recordings were leaked to the Washington Post by an FBI employee who had access to Patel's communications and decided that the American people needed to know the truth about what was happening to their government. The public reaction to the recordings was swift and severe. Even Trump's most loyal supporters in Congress found it difficult to defend the FBI director's plan to use federal law enforcement resources for partisan political purposes. Senator Rand Paul, who had been a consistent critic of what he viewed as FBI overreach during previous administrations, said that Patel's actions represented exactly the kind of political weaponization of law enforcement that we should all oppose regardless of which party is in power. The final blow to Patel's credibility came from an unexpected source, his own deputy, Dan Bongino. In a private meeting with Justice Department investigators, Bongino revealed that he had been keeping detailed records of Patel's directives because he had become concerned about their legality and had wanted to protect himself from potential criminal liability. Bongino's records included transcripts of conversations, copies of emails, and contemporaneous notes about meetings where political considerations had been explicitly discussed in relation to FBI personnel and investigative decisions. "I thought I was signing up to help reform the FBI and restore its credibility," Bongino told investigators in a sworn statement that was later leaked to the press. "Instead, I found myself being asked to participate in what I can only describe as the systematic destruction of everything the FBI is supposed to represent. When I realized that Kash was more interested in settling political scores than catching criminals, I knew I had to protect myself and preserve evidence of what was really happening." Bongino's cooperation with investigators was the final piece of evidence needed to build a comprehensive case against Patel. His records documented not just isolated incidents of political interference, but a systematic pattern of abuse that extended from the lowest-level personnel decisions to the highest priority national security investigation. The evidence showed that under Patel's leadership, the FBI had become essentially a private intelligence service for the Trump administration, with resources and capabilities being used to advance partisan political interests rather than protect the American people. The legal reckoning was swift and comprehensive. Federal prosecutors, armed with Patel's own admissions under oath and mountains of corroborating evidence, filed criminal charges including conspiracy to violate civil rights, abuse of office, and perjury. The charges were based not just on the political firings, but on the broader pattern of using federal law enforcement resources for partisan political purposes. State prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions also began investigating whether Patel's actions had violated state civil rights laws and employment protections. The civil lawsuits multiplied as more FBI employees came forward with claims of political retaliation and discrimination. What had started as a lawsuit by 3 agents grew into a class action case representing more than 200 current and former FBI employees who had been targeted for their perceived political unreliability. The financial exposure for the federal government was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars, not including the incalculable damage to the FBI's reputation and effectiveness. But perhaps the most significant consequence of the Patel scandal was its impact on public trust in federal law enforcement. Polling conducted in the months following his admission of political interference showed that confidence in the FBI had fallen to historic lows among Americans of all political affiliation. Republicans who had initially supported Patel's efforts to clean house at the Bureau found themselves struggling to defend actions that clearly violated basic principles of justice and fairness. Democrats, while vindicated in their warnings about political interference, took no satisfaction in seeing their worst fears about the weaponization of law enforcement confirmed. The international implications were equally severe. Foreign intelligence services that had cooperated with the FBI for decades began questioning whether they could trust an agency that had been so thoroughly politicized. Sensitive intelligence-sharing relationships were strained as allied nations wondered whether information they provided might be used for partisan political purposes rather than legitimate national security objectives. The damage to America's reputation as a nation governed by the rule of law rather than political whim was substantial and long-lasting. 6 months after the original lawsuit was filed, Kash Patel's tenure as FBI director came to an ignominious end. Facing multiple criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and congressional investigations, he submitted his resignation in a brief letter that attempted to portray himself as a victim of political persecution rather than the architect of systematic abuse. "I have served my country to the best of my ability," he wrote, "and I am proud of the work we accomplished in reforming the FBI and restoring its focus on law enforcement rather than political activism." The letter was widely viewed as a final insult to the agents and employees he had targeted for their perceived political disloyalty. Even Trump, who had initially defended Patel's actions, eventually distanced himself from his appointee, claiming that he had been misled about the extent of the political interference at the FBI. "Kash got carried away," Trump said in a statement released after Patel's resignation. "I wanted him to clean up the FBI, not turn it into a political organization. He disappointed me and he disappointed the American people." The cleanup process at the FBI was long and difficult. Patel's successor, a career law enforcement official with bipartisan support, spent months trying to restore the Bureau's credibility and professionalism. Hundreds of agents who had been fired or reassigned for political reasons were reinstated with back pay and formal apologies. New policies were implemented to prevent political considerations from influencing personnel decisions or investigative priorities. And comprehensive training programs were established to ensure that all FBI employees understood their obligation to serve the law and the Constitution rather than any political master. The three agents who had started it all, Brian Driscoll, Jensen, and Evans, were eventually vindicated not just in court, but in the court of public opinion. Their willingness to risk their careers and their reputations to expose political corruption had ultimately saved the FBI from complete transformation into a political weapon. They were honored by professional law enforcement organizations, invited to speak at law schools and police academies, and recognized as examples of the courage required to defend democratic institutions when they come under attack. Mark Zaid, the attorney who had represented the three agents, reflected on the case's significance in testimony before Congress about the need for stronger whistleblower protection. What we learned from the Kash Patel case, he said, is that the only thing standing between American democracy and complete corruption is the courage of ordinary public servants who are willing to risk everything to do what's right. Brian, Jensen, and Evans could have stayed quiet, kept their heads down, and preserved their careers. Instead, they chose to speak truth to power, even when that power was trying to destroy them. The Patel scandal also led to significant reforms in how the FBI director is selected and Congress passed legislation requiring more extensive background checks for senior law enforcement appointments, including psychological evaluations and detailed reviews of candidate statements and writings for evidence of partisan political bias. New oversight mechanisms were established to provide real-time monitoring of political interference in federal law enforcement, with mandatory reporting to Congress and the public when such interference is detected. Perhaps most importantly, the scandal served as a powerful reminder of the fragility of democratic institutions and the constant vigilance required to preserve them. The FBI had come within months of being completely transformed from a professional law enforcement agency into a political enforcement arm of the executive branch. Only the courage of a few dedicated public servants had prevented that transformation from becoming permanent and irreversible. The case also demonstrated the power of transparency and accountability in American democracy. Patel's downfall had not come from some external investigation or political opposition research, but from his own admissions under oath when confronted with evidence of his misconduct. The legal system, the free press, and congressional oversight had all played crucial roles in exposing the truth and holding a powerful official accountable for his abuse of authority. Today, law schools across America teach the Patel case as an example of how political corruption can infect even the most prestigious and powerful institutions of government, but also as proof that such corruption can be exposed and defeated when ordinary citizens have the courage to stand up for what's right. The case serves as both a warning about the constant threats to democratic governance and an inspiration about the power of individual integrity to preserve freedom and justice. The FBI itself emerged from the scandal chastened but ultimately strengthened. The experience of nearly losing its independence and integrity served as a powerful reminder to current and future agents about the importance of their oath to the Constitution and their obligation to serve the law rather than any political master. New training programs emphasized the historical importance of FBI independence and the personal responsibility each agent has to resist political pressure and interference. Brian Driscoll, who had started it all with a simple decision to document rather than comply with illegal orders, eventually returned to the FBI in a senior position focused on ethics and integrity. In his first speech to new agent trainees, he shared the lesson he had learned from his confrontation with Kash Patel. You will face moments in your career when you have to choose between your job and your integrity, between your career and your conscience, between what's easy and what's right. In those moments, remember that your oath is not to any person or any political party, but to the Constitution and the American people. And remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do for your country is to say no to people who think they have the power to make you do wrong. The story of Kash Patel's rise and fall serves as a permanent reminder that in American democracy, no one is above the law, no matter how powerful their position or how loyal their political connections. It also serves as a testament to the courage of ordinary public servants, who risk everything to preserve the integrity of the institutions they serve. Most importantly, it demonstrates that even in the darkest moments, when corruption seems to have infected the highest levels of government. The truth has a power that no amount of political pressure or intimidation can ultimately defeat. The American people deserved better than what they got from Kash Patel. The FBI deserved better than what they got from Kash Patel. And the cause of justice deserved better than what they got from Kash Patel. But thanks to the courage of 3 agents who refused to stay silent, the truth eventually came out, and American democracy proved once again that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. Their story continues to inspire new generations of public servants who understand that the preservation of democratic institutions depends not on the good intentions of those in power, but on the courage of those who are willing to hold them accountable when they abuse that power.